Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's meeting of Hammersmith and Fulham Council's Pension Fund Committee. I'm Ian Cassidy, the chair of the committee. This is a unique experience for all of us, our first hybrid meeting. So we have 4 of the councillors attending here in person in the council offices in Shortlands, and we're joined by Phil Triggs, our Director of Treasury and Pensions, and David Abbott, who is here to provide technical and possibly moral support as well as we navigate our way through this meeting. We're also being joined, obviously, by everybody else online, and the meeting is being broadcast live on YouTube. So it is, as always, the normal sort of rules for any of these meetings online. If everybody could make sure that they're kept muted unless called upon to speak, just to make sure there's no feedback or anything like this. And also, if committee members, if you're able to have your cameras on, that would be quite helpful, just so we can see all the members of the committee. What I'll do is, because we've got a few new members in the committee, a few new people in the meeting, I'll go around and we'll do introductions of the committee members. And then if I can just ask officers, when you speak for the first time on any of the items, if you're able to just introduce yourself so we all know who we are. So I'll go around the committee first. So we'll do, it's also a little bit of a microphone check. So I'll go through the people who are here in the meeting with me. So first of all, Councillor Rowbottom.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Helen Rowbottom, new to this committee and a councillor in Fulham.
And Councillor Ree.
Good evening, everyone. Councillor Rowan Ree for Askew Ward.
And Councillor Thorley.
Good evening, everyone. Councillor Matt Thorley. I represent Parsons Green and Wallen Ward.
And Councillor Caleb Landy joining us online.
Hi, I'm Councillor Jonathan Caleb Landy, and I represent Ravenscourt Park Ward.
And we're also joined by 2 co-opted members, Mike Adam.
Good evening, Chair. Mike Adam, former Munster Ward Councillor and now co-opted member.
And Peter Parkin, who is joining us. This is his first meeting, so welcome to the committee, Peter.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Parkin. I am the branch secretary of Unison, Hammersmith and Fulham. Thank you very much. Looking forward to this meeting.
Yes, you've joined us in probably what's going to be quite an interesting meeting in terms of how we manage our way through this. We'll go right into the first item. So, well, sorry, before we go into this, there's just one slight issue because of the odd way hybrid meetings work. In terms of items where there is a decision to be made, the actual voting in that decision can only be done by the people in the room with me here. Because of this, the legislation regarding these meetings has definitely not caught up with the existence of the internet or Zoom or any of these things. So in terms of those decisions, I think there's maybe only 2 or 3 items that are for decision tonight. The rest of the items are just to be noted. So for those items where there are decisions to be made, only the 4 of us in this room will be able to vote on those items. So just to bear that in mind when we get onto them, but we can do that when we get onto those items. So the first item is the appointment of the vice chair. And do the members present agree to appoint Councillor Matt Thorley as vice chair?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Congratulations, Matt, then. Thank you very much. And then if we go on to the second item, which is the appointment of co-opted members. And so, again, this is just a decision for those in the room. Do we agree to appoint Michael Adam and Peter Parkin as non-voting co-opted members for the next municipal year?
Agreed.
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 Welcome to the committee, Michael and Peter. So moving further on, we've got item number 3, apologies for absence. Apologies have been received from Rian Davis, the Director for Resources, and also we have apologies from Councillor Guy Vincent. And item number 4, declarations of interest. Do we have anybody who wants to make a declaration of interest? I'm seeing lots of heads being shaken, so I don't think we need any anything there. So the next thing, item number 5, minutes of the previous meeting. Are we happy with the minutes from the last meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Again, no major dissents. I think we're okay with that, to move ahead with that. And then we move straight on to item number 6, which is the draft minutes of the previous pension board meeting. I don't know if any of the officers want to comment on that, or are we just happy to take them as read? I assume we're happy to take them as read, and I'm noticing nods of assention for everybody here, so that's fine. And then we'll move on to the first kind of substantive item, which is the update on the Pension Administration Service. I think we've got David Hughes, who's introducing this report. Just before we get into it, we do have, as everybody I'm sure has noticed, a fairly chunky agenda for this evening, just because obviously we're paying catch up from various things that have been missed while we've all been working from home. So I think I'll just ask officers, make sure that everything's as brief as we can be. And I know I don't have to say this, but I'm sure all the members of the committee will make sure that their questions are brief and concise and to the point. But David Hughes, if you want to introduce yourself and introduce the item.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm David Hughes. I'm the Council's Director of Audit, Fraud, Risk and Insurance, and I chair the Pensions Task Force, which was established back in March 2020, following the Council's decision to come out of the current arrangements with Surrey County Council for the provision of pensions administration services. This update follows on from updates to the previous meetings of the committee. I'm pleased to inform you in summary really that actually the project is really going well, is really on track. We've got the full complement of people in the team, with one technical specialist about to be appointed very shortly. We are working very closely with LPPA, who will be the new provider from February next year, and Civica, who are the software provider supporting them, and also Aquila Hayward, who we've engaged to help us with the data transfer matters. It's really good actually to report that Surrey County Council's Pensions Administration Service are working very positively with us in terms of progressing the project. So we've got very clear project plans in place which are being followed, and we're going to time. The first data cuts took place in May this year, and that's been successfully completed. We're now in the process of carrying out the second data cut, which means we get to see how the data will perform in the new system and to be able to make adjustments before the subsequent data cuts that take place later in the year. I think Eleanor will cover off the backlog issues, which are identified in paragraph 17 onwards in the report, and really just to say that Eleanor and I are happy to answer any questions from the committee, conscious of the agenda, and that actually it's good to report that we are well on track with the project for go live in February next year.
Thanks very much, David. I don't know, do we have any other comments from any of the other officers on this, or are you happy for us to go straight into questions if we have any? I'm assuming we can go straight into questions. I don't know, do we have any questions from anyone here in the room? Or any yellow hands for anyone? I'm not noticing any yellow hands. Just quickly, David, I don't know if there's any, are there anything you want to draw attention to, or any worries you have or concerns, or is it all moving as smoothly as we'd like it to?
I think there's a lot of moving parts, Chair. So you'll be aware from previous reports that we're not the only authority leaving the Surrey County Council arrangements, but actually we're working closely with Surrey and those other partners to make sure that we're all exiting in a smooth and an orderly way. And so far, so good. So it's good to report that Surrey are performing really well and working very closely with us, which is really helpful.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. Unless I've got a hand up from Councillor Ree.
Thank you very much. Just a very brief question. Obviously, we're dealing with lots of data here in the move, and this is an area that's fairly heavily regulated. Are we confident that work is progressing and we're still meeting all of our regulatory obligations during the switchover?
So that's something which Eleanor will come on to in the next reports, Councillor Ree, but I'm happy that actually with the work we're doing with Surrey is progressing well, and they are seeking to ensure they're performing as well as possible, which is really important during this transition period.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
I'm not noticing any other hands up in the room, and I'm not seeing any other virtual hands. So I think, are we happy to note this and move on to the next item, which is, oh no, I've got a hand up from Peter. Hello, Peter.
Yes, Chair. Is it possible, could I ask a question? In terms of Surrey County Council, because I'm new to this committee, so I don't really probably the least experience, and I just want to know how, because I'm coming from a union perspective, and some of my members have worked in the council for 10, 20, 30, sometimes up to 40 years. When it's come traditionally for them to receive their pensions, they've always had a massive frustration in time lags, time delays, confusion. Are we working through that as well, David? That's what I'd like to know from my members.
We're working closely with Surrey County Council, Mr. Parkin, to make sure that Surrey actually perform as they should be during the period, but also to make sure, obviously, when we have the new service set up, which we went through a rigorous exercise to appoint LPPA, that the service will definitely improve as well. So we'll get a high quality service when we come to February next year. But I appreciate your point, and we are, Eleanor particularly is working very closely with Surrey to ensure that ongoing performance during this transition period is maintained as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. Assuming we're happy to note the report, I'm not seeing any dissension. Everybody seems fairly happy. So we can note item 7 and move on to item 8, which is Eleanor to come in and to introduce the Pension Administration Performance Update. Hello, Eleanor.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. My name's Eleanor Dennis, the Strategic Pensions Manager for Hammersmith and Fulham. So this paper sets out a summary of the performance for Surrey County Council in the provision of pension administration services to the fund. The performance has been measured over the period January to May 2021. So we can see that in key areas, there's been a real improvement in terms of meeting our KPI targets. So in particular, if we look at deaths, for 3 consecutive months, they have achieved 100% performance in March, April and May of this year. In retirements, we've seen performance of 100% in April and 91% in May. And that's a huge turnaround from the poor delivery in February of 50%. With transferring quotes, we had poor performance in January of 25%, and we've had an achievement of 74% in May. With transfers out, we've had 2 months of consistently achieving 80% of cases on time, and a positive move away from the levels in January of 53%. And that's carried through in the processing of transfers out, in which 100% of cases were processed in time in May. Again, a great turnaround from January, where only 57% of cases were completed on time. So all of these achievements show Surrey's commitment to delivering a good service, but also improving that, despite our decision to exit away from them. I continue to have monthly catch-ups to challenge that poor performance, but also to gain an understanding of the team's activity. And I know that early this month, they put in place a new team setup where KPIs are monitored more closely for all of the exiting funds. And it'd be interesting to see the impact of that followed through in our KPIs over the next few months. So I'd like to open the floor to any questions on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Just very quickly, maybe if you were to be, has there been any reluctance on Surrey's part to improve things, or have they needed any pushing from us, or have they actually been quite willing to kind of do their part to improve things? I mean, obviously, as you said, there is some improvement. There's a few things that are still not as good as we'd like, but how willing have they actually been to work with us and make an effort to improve the service that they're providing while they remain working for us?
Yeah, good question, Chair. So they absolutely have been quite proactive, actually, in terms of wanting to deliver that better service. I think the fact that other funds, a lot of funds are exiting from them, rather than sort of pushing back and not actually doing anything about the service. There is a real proactive attitude to wanting to improve in the time that we have left. And so actually they've been proactive and they've been coming up with solutions and working with me to improve the specific areas that I pull out in our monthly catch-ups.
That's great. Thanks very much. I've got a first hand up from Councillor Caleb Landy.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the table, and I was wondering what was going on with dependents benefits, where it seemed like it was getting worse. Are there any particular concerns that you have with that, or is that something that's likely to improve when we go into June and July?
I hope it's likely to improve, Councillor. It's more about the process that has led some of the reporting to not reflect the reality. So with dependency pensions, there's a lot of time delays in terms of waiting for a response, getting hold of the right people, those understanding that they're entitled to a benefit, and having up-to-date addresses there and sending in the right information at the right time. So it may well be the case is left open when in actual fact it should be closed if they're waiting for further information that's sitting with the relevant dependents.
Thanks very much. I see Mike Adams got a hand up. Mike.
I'm asking this question more in the spirit of how we go forward. It's very impressive that the service seems to be improving even whilst we're running down the contract. I think it's fair to say that perhaps as an authority we undermanaged this area historically. Maybe we didn't have enough resources, and that once we've got a team that's able to really look over Surrey's shoulder, we can force an improvement in performance. And had a lesson for us with the new regime that we can't stand off and assume LPFA will do everything that's necessary. We're going to have to keep people very much on the job and monitoring this quarter by quarter to make sure we get the service that we need.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. So you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone will shy away from the fact that a close eye wasn't kept at Surrey in the past. We didn't challenge them. We didn't look at the detail in terms of their performance and their delivery. And that makes an absolute difference. You're absolutely right in highlighting the need to carry that forward with the new provider. They have a much better reputation, but that's no need to slacken off in terms of the pressure and challenging them and making them accountable for their responsibilities. Because ultimately, as far as the regulator is concerned, it's not that you hand over to a third-party administrator. It's very much lands with you as the fund to meet the obligations. So yeah, very much agreed.
Thanks very much. I don't know if we have any questions from anybody in the room. I'm not noticing any hands up. So assuming there's no further questions, are we happy to note this report, everybody? I think seeing lots of nods, which is quite good. So thanks very much, Eleanor. Although you're straight up again for item number 9, pension fund data quality.
Thank you, Chair. So this paper sets out a summary of the key data issues for the Hammersmith and Fulham Fund and the mitigation that's been taken. So in February 2020, Surrey highlighted that the fund had around 1,700 legacy cases that were unprocessed and that they were unwilling to process on our behalf. After due diligence, the fund engaged with a third-party data management company called ITM, who have been processing the cases on our behalf, and work began in May of this year. 193 of those cases from the original batch were actually completed by Surrey themselves in the interim period. And also since starting the project, a further just over 100 cases have been identified as being out of scope. So out of scope means that those unprocessed cases actually fall back into the active business as usual cases. So it sits with Surrey to process as opposed to ITM. And those are cases such as active retirements or indeed death cases. Of the residual amount, so just over 1,300 cases in scope, ITM have completed just over a third of those, so just over 500 cases, and they'll continue to process as many cases as possible ahead of the LPPA migration. ITM are paid on a case-by-case basis, so the fund will not be charged for any unstarted cases, and any uncompleted cases will be forwarded to LPPA to pick up post-go live. In terms of quality assurance, as part of the project, due diligence has been carried out on around 20% of cases that have been checked by Surrey, and the feedback is that those cases not only have they been accurate, but they've been completed to a very high standard. In addition, through the project, it was identified that the fund had a large number of cases where the address was not held for members. So that's for over 600 member files. We had no addresses for them. ITM have carried out data tracing on those cases and verified and found around 63% of those cases. So just over 400 new addresses on member files that we now have that we didn't have before. So we can see that the impact of ITM is threefold, in that a third of cases are now processed that we're no longer. We've got member addresses updated that we didn't have before, and we know that the work is being carried out to a high standard. So we hope to see that reflected in the TPR scores that we'll receive at the end of the year. And I open the floor to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for introducing another report. Just one question. I noticed you mentioned the idea of I think was it 600 cases where there weren't addresses. Do we know? Obviously, there's kind of various historic reasons, I'm sure, why some of the data's not as good as we'd like, or isn't there, or has been lost, or whatever. Are ITM looking into any commonalities? You know, is there any kind of systematic sections of data that are missing? Are there any commonalities among the records? And are they able to report back to us as to why? You know, was this some kind of failing, perhaps potentially on our part, but also obviously we've had issues in the past with Surrey and other providers of services, BT managed services, etc. Is this something ITM's looking into, or we're looking into, in terms of any themes or commonalities in the data that's been missing, and if there are any explanations as to why that was, or any lessons we can learn from it?
Thank you, Chair. It's a very good question. So ITM are not currently looking at any commonalities. They do the electronic tracing, and they also do manual tracing on those member files. But what will come out in the LPP migration is those missing addresses will then form another project with LPPA as to further. So it's not a case of that we'll park those and we'll never look for those addresses again. That's when the analysis will come across as to identifying that residual number of cases where we still don't have an address despite them going through that electronic trace and the manual trace with that third party. It'll be looked at again with LPP to identify all of those data quality issues, which includes addresses, and find out those themes. So I hope to report back to you, over the coming months as to anything that we do highlight. In terms of the payroll services, I don't think we can necessarily lay the blame at that door. I think it really has to be looked at from an admin point of view in terms of that engagement piece with members to ensure that we have their up-to-date addresses to be able to give them information on their pension entitlement.
Thanks very much. I don't know if we have any questions. I'm not noticing any. Oh, I've got a question from Councillor Rowbottom.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Eleanor. I wondered if, partially because of my newness, you could just talk through what should happen in terms of when data should be collected, and can people access easily who have pensions with us this information to be able to update if they need to do anything proactively themselves?
Thank you, Councillor Rowbottom. So in terms of how easy it is for members, if I pick that question up first, so there is a member self-service, which is an electronic portal where members are able to look at any details on their pension and update them accordingly for example, their marital status, their address, etc. I think what you'll find, unfortunately, on the fund is that the take-up of that is very poor. So we do need to do some work in the future to increase the engagement there, to allow people to have visibility of the data that's held and correct any errors in that. As to when data should be accessed, They get members get an annual benefit statement. That's almost a sort of a wave in the corner to say you've got this entitlement. Please check the details and look at forward planning for at such time when you come to retire. But other than when the inception of them starting with an employer in the fund, most people would not really engage other than when they leave in terms of retirement. Even when they leave in terms of going to another employer, they're very unlikely to check the details. So I think it's the responsibility lies with us as a fund to keep engaged with all of our members, regardless of if they're still active or not. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So I suppose the onus is on employers rather than members, as you refer to them, to update this information. As in the missing data is the responsibility of the fund to update, as I've understood it.
It's the responsibility of the fund to update, but it's also the responsibility of the fund to check that information hasn't changed. And that's what we need to be better at.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a virtual hand from Peter Parkin. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Enola.
Hi, Peter.
Once again, the take-up is very poor, and we know that it's always been quite poor. Even when Surrey County Council was doing stuff, it was even, but it's got a bit better at the moment. And that's pleasing. That's actually pleasing to see. Just in terms of the legacy cases and ITM, how is that? Is that additional funding that ITM is being paid, or is that coming from the same funding that would have gone to Surrey County Council, or the Surrey County Council have they negated that responsibility?
So thank you, Mr. Parkin. So in terms of the cost of engaging with ITM, that has come separately from the fund. So the fund is paying additional costs to that, but Surrey would have charged us anyway for that work as an additional cost. So it would always have been an additional cost. However, you're right in highlighting the fact that a good administrator provider should be doing that work anyway.
And one last thing, in terms of the communications that to members and non-members really in pensions, what's the way forward for making communications more effective with take up?
So thank you, Mr. Parkin. So in terms of the increasing the member engagement, so increasing the level of comms, the frequency of that, LPP, our new provider, are very good at engaging with both employers and members. So we'll see that straight away once we go on board with them. There's also some work that we can do internally for Hammersmith and Fulham employees in terms of in those cyclical events. So when you're getting your annual benefit statement, encouraging people to sign up to the member self-service to check their details and to update them accordingly. So we can do that around the year. So it should be a joint effort, but ultimately it still sticks with the fund to actively be doing that. And we absolutely will be doing that going forward.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. I'm not noticing any other hands up in the room, and I'm not seeing any other virtual hands. Members here, are we all happy to note this report, note the contents? I'm saying general agreement. So thank you very much again, Eleanor. And we will move on to item 10, pensions regulator single code consultations. So I'll call on Phil Triggs to introduce. Hello, Phil.
Thank you, Chair. To be as brief as possible on this information item, the pensions regulator has regulatory authority for all pension schemes in the UK. That includes all defined contribution or defined benefit funded and unfunded schemes. The regulator only took over the LGPS some years ago, a couple of years back, and has that regulatory authority, for which there's been a slow phase in terms of the LGPS getting used to the regulator having that authority over all of our functions. So in recent months, the regulator has attempted to compile a single code of practice for all pension schemes in the UK. Now that, if I'd been consulted on that, say 6 months ago, I would have said that was a very ambitious project, because there is a lot of differences between the various schemes. The LGPS is a creature of statute, and is the only funded scheme in the UK for which there is a base of assets to fund those pension payments. So given all of those differences, the regulator produced a draft code, and in fairness to the attempt, it was, as a start, it was a pretty good attempt, and we've been invited to provide a feedback to that consultation. The one criticism is that the nuances of the LGPS, being a creature of statute, for which everything we do is defined either by the original Superannuation Act back in the 70s or the Public Service Pensions Act of 2013, and all of the various tranches of regulation that exist, doesn't seem to take account of those statutes and regulations. So where I can, I've picked up where we are governed specifically by statute and regulation, and made mention of that in the response that I provided. So the response is on pages 84 to 88 of this pack. And I'd be very glad to take any questions if there are any specific queries on how I've responded and what this single code could mean for the local government pension scheme.
Thanks very much, Phil. I don't know if we have any questions. Are there any questions? I've got a hand up from Mike Adam. Mike.
Thanks, Phil. Could you summarise in practical terms, will the implementation of this code affect the way that we administer our fund? Does it have any implications for asset allocation or the way it operates as the governance supervision of the fund?
So thanks, Mike. I mean, if there were to be changes and they were in direct contravention of a specific statute or part of any regulation, the MHCLG would need to issue new regulations to cover that. One area that we have raised an eyebrow is that there is this arbitrary 20% limit that's been applied to all non-regulated assets. Now, back in 2016, the LGPS was subject to a whole host of limits on specific asset allocations, and the MHCLG decided to leave it to the best judgment of the investment committees, pension fund committees, yourselves, members, as to making sensible decisions about asset allocation. So there was no need to provide limits. It was your prudential responsibility and your best judgment as to how the fund should be invested. So that arbitrary 20% limit on non-regulated assets, that does move us back kind of a decade or so into the old days, and there has been some pushback against that. So I would expect a vastly different document to come out of the consultation process when a final code is published.
Thanks very much, Phil. I'm assuming that other local authorities are raising similar concerns.
Yes, the consultation has been widely responded to by the 89 administrating authorities in England and Wales, by the Local Government Association, by the PLSA. All of the pressure groups that act on our behalf will have provided separate responses and would have picked up on the points that I have.
Thanks very much, Phil. I don't know if we have questions from anyone else. Councillor Ray.
Thank you very much. Just a bit of a sort of personal rant. So I often find that these sort of codes of practice tend to be sort of chance for regulators to do a bit of a power grab, things that they wouldn't necessarily be able to get through if they had to consult in setting new rules themselves. Often they'll try and sneak into codes of practice. As my understanding of the code of practice is that it's sort of best practice guide or expectations. What are the sort of consequences? What are the proposed consequences for schemes that don't meet the expectations? And particularly, I suppose, in relation to that 20% rule that you just mentioned.
Well, most codes of practice are set out on a comply or explain basis. So you comply with the best practice, or if you don't, you would set out very clearly specific reasons why you choose not to comply. If it's in regulation, we definitely would obey because it's law. The other point I was going to make with regard to the LGPS, there is something known as statutory guidance. Now, statutory guidance flows from regulation. So again, this is the government's ambition set out in black and white, for which again we would be expected to comply without any good reason not to. Now, in recent months, because of the Palestine court case at the Supreme Court on LGPS investment policy, the Supreme Court decided that statutory guidance issued by the department, we're not necessarily bound to adhere to that. So that's something for which officers are interpreting at this time, and which hopefully the government will comment on when it issues a further consultation on the LGPS in the next few months. So these are various bits of authority: code to practice, where it's comply or explain, statutory guidance, regulation, or actual statute for which we would be expected to adhere to.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if we have any other questions from the room. I'm not seeing any other hands, and there's no virtual hands. So I'm assuming, are we happy, committee members, to note this report, accept it? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. So the next item, we've got number 11. Item 11, governance review, log of recommendations. Again, this is Phil to introduce. Phil.
Thank you, Chair. So members will record the previous meeting. Officers presented a governance review that was published by consultant John Raisin. This was quite a tome of findings that he'd investigated and come up with some 32 recommendations for best governance of the Hammersmith and Fulham Pension Fund. So all of those were approved by the committee, apart from one specific one, which looked at total responsibility for investment and administration, which the committee decided to put that one on hold for the time being. So that was 33 recommendations. 32 were actually passed as approved as good practice. So officers have decided to keep a log of these and to report on progress as each committee comes in the future. Obviously, the workload to get all 32 in within one committee cycle, that's pretty immense. And a lot of those involve administration, where obviously the single resource is taken up by the move to LPP. So we will keep an update. The log on page 92 will update. Green is where we've achieved in its entirety the recommendation. So you can see the green, the shaded green areas looking at governance, training, the business plan, the budget, the risk register, and the internal audit processes. And then the orange areas where we've started the process, we're some way through but not fully complete. And then the red areas where that would infringe on the administration team who are currently devoted elsewhere.
Thanks very much, Phil. I don't know, we've got one virtual hand I can see. Councillor Caleb Landy.
Thank you so much, Chair and Phil, for that explanation. I guess the question I had, and apologies if I missed this in my reading, but I couldn't see a date when we expected to have all 31 recommendations enacted by, because it's completely understandable that it's going to take a while. but I think it would be useful to at least have a date when we think we'll be able to have achieved it.
Yeah, in that, in the recommendations log in the timeline, there is in the middle column a timeline as to the expected date by which to achieve that particular approval. The latest date that we have is 31st of March next year, 2022. I am obviously willing to engage extensively with David and Eleanor to assess the workload as far as the administration is concerned. If there is any good reason to extend that, maybe beyond March 22, then we certainly would bring that to the committee. But we're hoping to get through all of this within 12 months from this committee cycle.
Thanks very much. Got Councillor Ree has a hand up here.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt again. In terms of the timeline immediacy column, how did we go about assigning immediate or not immediate scores to this? There's a couple of items that are marked as a matter of urgency, and which have been listed as not immediate. Is that because we disagree with how urgent we think they are?
It's yes, in scale, in the scheme of things, the switch of administration is seen as the most urgent task. I mean, getting pensions paid is the most important part of any pension fund's governance. So that administrator switch is taking rightful precedence over everything. Obviously, within that schedule, there are a number of urgent items, but they're not as urgent as the administrator change.
We've not considered getting in temporary additional resource to do this, hiring a consultancy to come and do some of these things for us.
Well, a lot of them would involve me engaging specifically with David Hughes and Eleanor in terms of getting their input into various aspects of those 32 approvals. So I'm of the view that it wouldn't necessarily help if we had an extra resource, because we would still need to engage extensively with Eleanor and David.
And specifically, number 27, when we're looking at compliance with the code of practice. As you explained earlier, this is the code works on a comply or explain basis. It seems from reading this, we're not sure which areas of the code we currently comply with and which ones we don't. It seems to me that this is something we should be aware of fully on an ongoing basis. Why has this not been made a priority?
Yes, and in terms of that specific part of the code, John Raisin rightly highlighted that as one of the most important areas that we need to devote resources to. But as I say, as soon as the administration switches over, that number 27 is the first one that we would switch to.
The switchover is going to take a long time. Yeah, we've been through the timelines for us. I'm not particularly comfortable about us not knowing whether or not we're compliant with our obligations here. And it does make me wonder what other areas of compliance we're not entirely sure about. Do we have the resources? Sorry, I feel like I'm repeating myself. Do we have the resources within the team to make sure that we're fulfilling all of our regulatory obligations while we're doing this particularly drawn out and complicated project?
Chair, I'd be very happy to seek the guidance of David and Ella on that specific question on the code of practice, where we would need to look specifically any shortcomings that this fund has on that code of practice.
Are you happy for them to come in at the moment?
If David is there.
Do we have David there?
Yeah, indeed, Chair. So I'm happy to take that away with Eleanor. So I know we are very much focused on the implementation of the new provider, but as we're doing that, we are working closely with colleagues at Surrey to make sure we are getting good levels of compliance in the service we're providing now. And if Ella wants to add any more to that?
Thank you, David. So absolutely, that's part of managing the pension administration service, to make sure that we are being compliant. So, for example, in terms of benefit statements, that they have to be sent out each year. They have to be sent out within a reasonable time frame, and the member has to be told if the most up-to-date salary has not been used and the reason for that. And absolutely, sorry, the deadline is August. Sorry, have sent those out to LBHF active members just last week. And so we are ahead of schedule. They are compliant. I think there's about 11 cases that are outstanding on other employers within the fund, and they are working with us to get that information up to date so that they are able to deliver to the rest of the employers within the fund the annual benefit statements ahead of the August deadline. So absolutely, we are working in a compliant manner, regardless of exiting from Surrey.
Okay. Do we have a dedicated compliance officer working for the fund?
Councillor Reid, there isn't a compliance officer that is in place in the team, no.
Do we think we should have one?
There is one of the latest recruitments that posts that I've recruited for just last week. Their part of their remit will be to help me to ensure that the fund remains compliant on the pension administration side. So it is something that I've encompassed within the team to help me to address any issues and to stay on top of that.
Chair, if I could come in there, I mean that aspect does come into the part of the report by John Raisin, where he was seeking to the fund identifying one single officer to have responsibility for the entire governance process. So with myself as the responsible officer for the investment process, and Eleanor as responsible officer for the administration. Now, good governance, the generally accepted good governance is that one of us would have responsibility for the entire process, and that is quite common amongst administrating authorities in the UK. So it was, as I've already said, the decision of the committee to put that on hold for the time being, but it's one area that maybe could be revisited in the future to check that that single officer has the entire responsibility for the whole show and can make those necessary decisions as and when they are required.
Okay, so who within the administration, is that you, who is responsible for if there was a breach in breach of regulations? Who is it who gets the handcuffs slapped on them?
If there was a breach in the administration side, then in terms of the way forward, it would be for the administration head and then or to report that to the head of HR, and also Emily Hill, a Section 151 officer, would also have an involvement in that.
Emily, Eleanor, you're on the hook for this. Are you comfortable with the measures we've got in place at the moment?
If Emily wants to come in first.
I'm sorry, Councillor, it was taking me time to switch my camera on and take my mute off. Yes, I think so, that's right. I mean, there are a number of things that Section 151 officers need to keep abreast of. We need to ensure there is sort of adequate oversight and governance of arrangements. But yes, I'm as comfortable as I can be with many things I need to sign up on this one. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Emily Hill, Director of Finance.
Thank you, Emily. And yes, absolutely, that's part of my remit. That's why I have the regular conversations with Surrey on a monthly basis in terms of performance, as well as in the exit meetings that are with Surrey. I highlight the compliance and the need to continue to deliver and to be accountable for administration right up until we move with LPP. In the engagement meetings with LPP and leading the project, I absolutely ensure that LPP understand obligations in terms of taking the service over, but also ensuring that they have caveated any scenarios such as the data qualities and GMP obligations in terms of the project plan and delivery as soon as we hit go live. So very comfortable with the obligations and responsibilities, and in terms of how we address those should any areas be a red flag.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there. I will just say this is clearly a very big project. This is clearly taking up a lot of resource and a lot of people's time. I'm concerned that we don't let other more mundane day-to-day matters of regulatory compliance fall by the wayside because of it. Perhaps it might be useful in a future meeting and later on in the year or next year, perhaps, just to have a general paper on how we go about ensuring regulatory compliance on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, I'll leave it there today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have any other. Oh, I've got one hand from Councillor Rowbottom.
Thank you. I note recommendation 24 also is described as sort of to be updated as a matter of urgency. That's the communications policy, which hasn't been updated since 2016. I wondered if you could, if someone could outline what that would include and if that's a communications policy to the members or other, what that's what's not being done while that's not updated.
Yes, Councillor, you are correct that it's there is a reasonably considerable time period to the last previous update. That's something that really should be updated at least every 3 years. It does cover mostly the communications between the administering authority and its beneficiaries. So those are active members, preserve benefit members and the pensioners. So that is primarily an administration matter. Eleanor, are you still there in terms of when that next update could come?
Yes, thank you. So it is something, as Phil has explained, that outlines how we communicate with our membership. I think that it's absolutely outstanding, but there's a lot of things, to be fair, that are outstanding that I've inherited, and it takes time to resolve all of those. It's not everything can be resolved in one hit. I think you have to prioritise things in order to do things properly, because we can't just do it in order to tick the box. It must absolutely be done properly and methodically. So I think we need to bear that in mind when we're going through the number of things that need to be addressed. So earlier on, we spoke about managing the relationship with the pension administration provider, and that's consumed a lot of the time and effort in me being engaged in this post. And so a lot of those compliance issues are outstanding and will be addressed. I can't give you an exact timescale because I need to put that into a plan, but I absolutely in the next meeting will update you as to where we are with that. If we have a draft, it'll be for the members to agree that policy, and then it will be published on the intranet.
Great, thanks, Eleanor. It's I recognise there are so many recommendations. It's and you're making great headway on some of them we've seen tonight. It's more just to contextualise which bits therefore might be a bit weaker. So if that's impacting, for instance, the data collection point, we spoke earlier about needing to engage members' pensioners on data. It's just to have that to contextualise why the numbers might be as they are, rather than see them blind, as it were. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Councillor.
I'm not seeing any other hands up from anyone. I'm assuming, therefore, we're happy to note this report. I'm seeing some nods of the head. Excellent. Again, thanks very much to the officers. If we move on to the next item, it's number 12, pension fund draft accounts. Phil.
Chair, I'm very happy to hand over to Matt Hobson for this item.
Hi, Matt, if you want to introduce yourself and say hello to everyone.
Hi everyone, it's Matt Hobson here, Strategic Investment Manager. I will now present the item on the accounts. So the accounts has been a long process this year for the authority, and we only finalised the final version, I think, last week. So this one's slightly out of date, but all the important items are still relevant. So in terms of the key items that members will be interested in, they'll obviously be interested in the overall returns of the fund. So after a very torrential year at the back end of 2020, where market falls were significant and the fund was down to about $1 billion in size, it's since made a full recovery, up 21.9% for the year. So, and the return was significantly above the benchmark as well. So the fund's defensive positioning had helped it quite well in terms of outperformance, and some of the indice decisions were good ones. But we'll touch on the performance of the fund a bit later. But from an accounting purpose, the most sort of stark thing that members will be interested in would be the management costs, which have risen from just shy of 6 million to just shy of 9 million, which is around a 50% increase. So while that will alarm members in terms of that number, there are some key factors to think about as to why that is. The most important being we have identified costs that we wouldn't have included in previous years due to better financial reporting. So these are mainly around transaction costs. So as an example, our manager Rafa, its transaction costs were around 900,000 this year, which previously we've recorded zero. So that's a cost that we were always incurring due to these churn of transactions. We just didn't know about it. So because previously these costs were kind of subsumed in the overall fund returns, but now we've taken them out and sort of recognized them by grossing up our returns and then grossing up our costs. So the net effect is zero, but it just shows the cost in a more transparent way. And the other major reason is our costs have increased due to the fund transferring from passive equity to a more expensive active equity manager. So members will recall this transition to the Morgan Stanley fund through the CIV, the Global Sustain Fund. And the fees on that are considerably higher than our passive equity portfolio. So those are the main sort of things I wanted to point out. Happy to take any questions on any of it, if members do have any.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just one again, and obviously expenses and costs is something that I know a lot of outside observers are always interested in looking at how much local authorities are spending on expenses. I mean, first of all, well, just sort of two questions. Firstly, have we had anyone query them externally? Because I know that's something that has happened to local authorities. And do you think we've got a robust enough explanation? The other thing was just on page 113. Yes, the investment management expenses have obviously gone up fairly considerably, but as have admin costs and oversight and governance costs. Are you able to go into those two a little bit as well?
Apologies, I couldn't find the screen. I've got so many things in front of me. So first question, no, they haven't had any queries. The accounts draft have only just been published. So whilst we prepared these pension fund accounts some time ago, the main accounts of updraft has literally just been published. So there wouldn't have been any time for anyone to have any questions anyway. The administration costs is a fairly, although I'm sure Eleanor could talk to the detail, there's a number of things that have been going on in terms of bringing the service in-house, hiring a lot more people. There's expected transition costs for the transition to LPPA. There's obviously a number of one-off project costs that have been going on in recent years with the likes of hiring external consultants to clear backlogs and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons for one-off costs and reason why they've increased in terms of administration. And the way that we separate our administration, oversight, governance costs out, a lot of those costs in terms of project work is also in the oversight and governance area. So in terms of the core things that I would normally think of in terms of oversight and governance, in terms of your investment consultancy, the officers who prepare the accounts and investment advice, that hasn't actually increased. It's more these project style costs that really have added, although it is not much in absolute terms. I can understand it's a fair bit in percentage terms. It doesn't take too much to make it look like a bigger number.
Yeah, thanks very much. I've got a virtual hand up from Peter Parkin. Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. In terms of the 900,000 transaction costs, as a very fresh layperson to this committee, could you just tell me what are transactions costs that come to 900,000, and why? How was it that it wasn't detected, but it was sort of detected now? What kind of change that made us see that? And in terms of the investment management higher fees, how did that? How much more of a fee increase is that from the previous fee increase? And just for my benefits, I don't know, as I said before, is there any way that investment fees or fees can be negotiated, or is it just a set line and we just have to accept that?
There's quite a lot in those questions. I'll take the back end first. So in terms of the fees for Morgan Stanley, the fees are about 15 times higher than what we actually paid the manager. Now, the reason for that is the manager is a different type of asset allocation. So a passive equity provider with LGIM simply tracks the index. So if the index goes up, your investment returns go up. If the index goes down, your investments go down, and it follows it in a linear way. Whereas when you hire an active manager, you're aiming to outperform the market in the long run by taking active equity decisions and taking, in theory, better decisions than what the market would be if you just bought everything equally. So that's why the committee took the decision to move to that manager. They didn't want to just pay higher fees. They were aiming to basically pay higher fees to get a higher return. That's the aim of this process. And also the manager offered a very specialist service in that it was providing a sustainable mandate. So it had a lot of exclusions, and a lot of the stock purchases are built around the idea of sort of a sustainable economy, so excluding fossil fuels and all this other stuff. So the manager charges a higher premium, and the fees were negotiated by the London Civ, which obviously is if you're new to this, you might not know much about, which that's the pool in London that manages a lot of London pension funds assets. And so they negotiated that fee centrally on behalf of all of their clients, which is all 32 boroughs, or 32 pension funds rather. So I hope that answers that part of your question. In terms of the transaction costs, so this manager, there's a few of them where there was transaction costs, but the one that's the largest is Ruffer. So I'll just explain that one. So Ruffer is a manager which has a lot of freedoms, so they can invest in lots of different things. Some of those assets more expensive than others. We even included going into Bitcoin over this period at one stage, which was a bit of an off-piste investment, but they made a great return out of it and sold at a very high level. But these buying and selling investments, particularly bonds or equities, or especially if it's something like gold, which they do have as well, that incurs a cost. So that the fund will have to pay brokers or have to pay market fees for these types of transactions when they're buying and selling things. Now, previously, what would happen is the fund would swallow those costs, because it's a whole fund that we invest in. We don't buy the individual stocks and shares and bonds. The manager deals with all that, and so previously that cost would be borne by the fund, and it's not actually charged to us. So it's the fund that bears the cost. But what we're doing this time is we're recognising our share of that cost, because we want to be clear that transaction fees are happening. It's just that they're not so obvious. And in terms of the information, there's been quite a drive over cost transparency. So over the last few years, managers are required to fill out cost transparency templates and demonstrate where these transaction costs are, whereas previously that was not required. So the more and more that managers are getting used to this cost transparency, the better information we're getting about the real underlying costs in terms of transactions and other types of costs. I hope that covers everything.
Does, Matt. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
I've got a hand up from Mike Adam. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So, Matt, just to follow on from that, are you reasonably comfortable that you now have the whole picture as far as all the different managers are concerned? So this is as complete a picture as we can have about the real cost of various mandates. And secondly, to your point, I think we were in a position a few years ago where we were more transparent than certain other funds, and we actually got quite a bit of stick because people just looked at the headline figure. But relatively speaking, we had a very high manager fees, and other people just weren't expressing the fee costs in the same way as we were. So I'm wondering if you think that is potentially the case, whether we should add a note to the account maybe next year, if it's like this year, to make it clear the basis on which we are calculating these fees, so that somebody like a Michael Johnson doesn't apples and oranges and start unjustly criticising us.
I think that last point is a good one, Mike. And bear in mind, these are draft accounts. I will get that added in because I think that the jump does, although the jump it's not actually black and white as to the reasons. So I think we will add that in and try and say that due to the cost transparency initiative, we are recognising more transaction costs than we have done previously. What other councils are doing, I know I can say that all the ones I work with closely are doing the same thing and they're recording it accordingly. But yeah, obviously there might be some who are still not doing it and are still not paying as much attention to it. But ultimately, these cost transparency templates are becoming standard practice. And if you're not following them, the auditors are starting to expect to see them. So if you're showing cost transparency templates with costs that are not in your accounts, people are going to ask questions as to why that is. So I think it will become the norm in the short to medium term, really. And
it's like something that ought to be coordinated through LGPS centrally. And I just wonder whether you might usefully speak with Jeff Houston or one of his team and see whether we can lobby for a common template for all the LGPS funds to do it the same way.
So it is a common template. So this has come from LGPS. We have the cost transparency initiative, and the template that we give managers to fill out is the same. So LGPS has got our own template that we've asked managers to fill out. This has been going on for several years. Private sector have got their own one as well, which is slightly different, but it's a bit behind where we are. We have got our own template, which we have, because this has been an LGPS drive to get better information, improve transparency. So we have been some of the leaders on this process. And I know in London we have a cost transparency working group where we're talking about these things regularly and how we can improve information, and also how we're reporting in terms of the CIV, in terms of fee savings, which are not always clear when to think of transaction costs and transition costs and that type of thing. And to go right back to your first question, I'm pretty sure we've got everything, but you're not going to know what you don't know. So we've got all the cost transparency templates from everyone, but unless you send someone forensically over to Boston to investigate Oak Hill's underlying accounts, we can only go on the good faith that we've got everything. But yes, it's a tricky one because obviously you're not paying them anything directly, so you're not keeping track of money moving in and out. So you just have to go on the templates that are provided and account for that accordingly.
I think Phil Triggs wants to go in. Phil.
Yes, Mike, in answer to your question, as Matt says, the need to account for these costs, it does arise from a CIPFA template. It's a type of code of practice. As we've already said, the codes of practice, you can either comply or choose not to and explain. On this one, we choose to comply for obviously very good reasons of transparency and accountability. You mentioned other local authorities. West Midlands is the leader in this. Now, they went fully transparent. It was about 5 or 6 years ago. Now, in their one set of accounts before they chose to undertake this exercise, I think their investment fees were about 15 million. They then went to town on the entire process. And in the next set of accounts they produced, I think that was 15, 16, their fees and charges went from 15 million to about 84 million. And it made absolute national headlines, and they took a lot of negative press over that. But that was the start of their process, to get it all out in the open and then try and start to reduce it. So 84 million in 1 year. They went to town on those costs and managed to reduce them the following year to about 69. So they knocked 15 million off, which would have remained entirely not transparent if that exercise hadn't been carried out. So as Matt says, it's in our interest to identify those fees and charges and costs as best we can, and then that gives us a platform on which to try and reduce them in the future.
Thanks very much. I don't know if we have any other questions from, Phil, sorry.
Yeah, coming to the end of that item, I should mention the work that was done by Patrick Rowe and also Matt Hobson in compiling these accounts. You remember previous fund manager was Tim Mapofu, given the National Rising Star Awards in the Pension Fund Awards. He got that award and then promptly left us, where he now heads up the Haringey Pension Fund. So we had to act quickly, and we got a great new recruit, Patrick Rowe, in his final year as a graduate trainee, taking his SIPFA exam. So not only did he compile these accounts under Matt's tutorship, but he's now passed his SIPFA final examination. So it's I think we should mention Patrick in the minutes for the work that he did, and also Matt Hobson for giving the necessary guidance to him.
Yes, no, I think more than happy for the minutes to reflect that. And yeah, I think everybody in the committee can thank them for their work. And we look forward to meeting our new recruit in person when we eventually start meeting back in the council offices. I'm not sure if we have anybody else wanting to raise any other points. I'm not seeing any hands. So are we all happy to note this, move on to the next item? Excellent. So if we move on to item 13, so it's the GAD review update. Phil.
Thank you, Chair. This is a piece of work. It's a triennial piece of work carried out every 3 years. It aligns with the actuarial valuation. It's a study that's carried out by the government's actuaries department, whereby they look on a level playing field, all the LGPS administering authorities in England and Wales, look at the actuarial results and rank them on a level playing field of assumptions employed in the actuarial process. So this was first carried out in 2016 for the 2016 valuation. They reported a couple of years later, 2018, as the first trial run of this study. This particular bit of work is a result of the 2019 valuation. So obviously 2 years later, reporting in 2021. And they report on the basis of a series of green flags for all of the practices carried out within the fund. So Hammersmith and Fulham has a clean sweep of green flags for all of the processes that are followed in the actuarial process. And then the most telling figure is the funding level, which with the Barnett-Waddingham actuarial process was just below 100% according to their actuarial assumptions. Once the government actuaries department has got their hands on the data and have applied the level playing field assumptions, we then move up to a funding level of just over 100%, 100.5%. So obviously a surplus position. It does also look at the required investment return, which in terms of the rankings, the Hammersmith Fund, being a diversified fund in terms of asset allocation, it's not focusing to the same extent on equities as with other local authority funds. So that's some way down the scale, but that diversified fund does hold us in good stead occasionally. And we saw that with the downturn that we had in the pandemic 12 months ago, where Hammersmith is one of the best performing funds in the country. So suffice to say, Chairman, it's a positive report for Hammersmith and Fulham, and very happy to report on that basis.
Thank you very much. I think what might be helpful, obviously, I know we've got a few new members of the committee. Are you able to just give a little background as to funding level and what it means, but also just once you hit that magic number of over 100%, what does that then mean for the future of the fund? Where do we go from here?
Okay, well, making it brief, Chair, a funding level is the fund's ability to pay for its future pensions, going quite a long way into the future. So the best example or best illustrative example I can give, if a college leaver started work with Hammersmith and Fulham tomorrow, an 18-year-old, there's a high chance that we would be paying a pension to that leaver if that recruit was in the employment of Hammersmith and Fulham for the entire career and then retired. There's a high chance we would pay the pension of that recruit going into the 22nd century, to going into 2100s. So it's a long-term assessment of pensions outflows from the fund's asset pool and the ability of that asset pool to pay those future pensions. Now, how it's done is that all of those future cash outflows are consolidated into one net value as at today. So if you could imagine, if I retired tomorrow, I would get a pension according to my salary and my career average related earnings. And then the following year, hopefully it would go up with inflation. It's contracted to rise with inflation as the years pass. Now, on those years as they progress, year 1, year 2, year 3, I might be a pensioner for, say, 30 years, hopefully. As the years progress, you're getting further and further away. So that in terms of the valuation of that pension, the actuary has to discount it. And as you go further and further into the future, it's discounted more and more and more. So you're bringing back that valuation to today's valuation on the basis of my estimated longevity. When I finally would pass away, pension would stop. So that's an estimate by the actuary. And the actuary will discount all those flows back to today's valuation. Now, as well as the outflows of pension, you've obviously got an asset base for Hammersmith and Fulham, £1.3 billion. You've also got all of the future contributions from me and from the employer going into that fund. You've got the investment returns. So you've got a series of assets on one side and a series of liabilities on the other. And you have a net value for one, net value for the other. And the funding level, if you've got 100% funding level, it means your asset base is the same as your liability base. And that's known as the funding level.
And once you beat 100%, what happens? What does that then mean for the future of the fund? What do we think about in terms of investments? But also, maybe from the point of view of the councils, what does that mean for the contribution from the council tax base?
Well, Hammersmith and Fulham has only recently reached, is approaching 100% funding level in recent years. So previous valuations has been a funding level of, say, between 90 and 95%. Now, the actuary would calculate specific deficit contributions that we would be required to be paid in. So Hammersmith and Fulham would contribute specific deficit sums that would bolster the fund up to its 100% funding level over a time period. So usually deficit time periods could run up to, say, 15, 20 years. So it's a kind of an installment process by which you're gradually contributing these sums to get the 100% funding level. In theory, once you're at 100% funding level, the council wouldn't be required to pay any more deficits. That's the way it works.
Has anyone got there?
Kensington and Chelsea at the moment is about 135% funded. So they haven't paid deficit contributions for quite some time.
And thank you very much for that. I don't know if we have any other questions from anyone else. I'm not noticing any hands. So are we happy to acknowledge the recommendation? I think we all are. Excellent. Thank you very much. And we move on to item 14. And just to add to the excitement of the meeting, this has a decision. So the recommendation at the end of this paper is that the Pension Fund Committee is requested to approve the breaches of the law, policy and guidance document. So that decision can only be taken by the 4 members who are here in the room. Obviously, we can take comments externally, but in terms of the actual decision process, that's for us. And also it's for us only in this room to make any suggestions or changes to that decision. But I'll let Phil introduce, and hopefully it should be uncontentious.
Thank you, Chair. This one's for Matt Hobson to present.
Hi, everyone. So yes, this kind of touches on rather what we talked about earlier in terms of breaches. So effectively, what we're recommending is that we have a breaches policy and we have guidance so that any employees around the administration team will be aware of what a breach is and when they should report it. So there's a lot of information in terms of in these appendixes. I don't intend to go into all of it, merely just sort of to summarize that we have why do you need to report a breach? Well, it's the pension regulator says you need to report one. And also you've got a form to fill in, you've got guidance notes of what is a serious breach, what isn't, who it needs to be reported to, and how we manage those breaches. And so there's sort of a decision tree about what's material, what isn't material. And I think it's the appendix 5. I haven't got it, it's not labeled in front of me, because the actual breaches policy, and that has the 4 appendixes with it. So it's kind of a 10-step process that sets out good practice, what we should be doing, including requirement for training for staff. And I think it touches on a lot of the stuff we already talked about and a lot of the things that we should be doing in terms of just formalizing a lot of things that we do already. So sort of the likes of Eleanor and the team will already know when we have a breach, but this kind of formalizes those processes and make sure that we're actually aware of when we should be reporting and when not. So I didn't want to go into any more detail than that, but happy to take any questions. I think it would probably be an answer by committees. There's a lot of different things in there depending on what the question is, but happy to take questions if there are any.
Thanks very much, Matt. I don't know if we have any questions in particular. I'm not seeing any questions in the room. I'm not seeing any virtual hands up. On that basis, I think we are quite happy to go ahead with the decision. Just for the purposes of recording, et cetera, and obviously bearing in mind that it can only be the people in this room here, are we in this room happy to approve the breaches of law, policy and guidance document?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, everyone. That is agreed, and thanks again, Matt. And hopefully that is compliant and our officers have no fear that we're going to be challenged on this. So we'll move on to item number 15, the quarterly performance update. Just again, to add some excitement and a frisson of danger to this section, this potentially has some issues which may be exempt and will need to form part of the exempt agenda. Obviously, because we're broadcasting, if there are any exempt issues, we'll need to have them all at the end of the meeting because we'll have to switch off the live broadcast, as these will be issues that are to be discussed in private only, as they may be commercially sensitive for whatever other reason. But if we move into this item, obviously, officers, if you do want to flag up, if you think this is straying into an exempt discussion, we can then have that particular conversation at the end of the meeting. But yeah, so go back to Phil for the quarterly performance update.
So Matt will introduce the first part of the report and then we'll be assisted by Kevin Humferson.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Chair. So this one, hopefully we can keep it all in the public domain. There are a couple of exempt bits and pieces throughout the appendix, but I think they're largely speak for themselves, and if we have to touch on them, we can always come back to them at the end, but I'm hopeful that we can just get through this now rather than have to come back to it. So yeah, just to introduce the report, we briefly touched on earlier about performance. The fact it was a good year for the fund. We returned, it's now its highest level ever. It's far and above, exceeded where we were in March last year and fearing the worst. So that has been a good sign. What has been slightly strange is that although assets have risen to far higher than they ever have been before, the liabilities have also risen higher. So our liabilities now stand at 1.28 billion, assets 1.21 billion. So the funding level has actually dropped from 98% to 95% because the liabilities have risen faster than assets. Now, this is mainly due to discount rates going down quite significantly due to the fact that bond yields are so low at the moment, and that's what drives the liabilities. And so obviously where investments are at all-time highs, certainly in equity markets, the actuaries aren't anticipating significant further returns in the short to medium term, hence the liabilities have gone up because your future return expectations are reduced. I'm happy to hand over to Kevin now for any more detail on the actual investment performance, but before that, is there any questions on the administrative side of the paper? There wasn't anything I particularly wanted to highlight, but if there are any questions on the areas of not investment, happy to take those first.
I'm seeing shakes of the head in the room. I'm not seeing any virtual hands, so I think we're okay to go ahead.
In that case, I'll hand over to Kevin and Andrew.
Just obviously, Kevin, just if you want to introduce yourself, just for the purpose of the recording and for new members of the committee.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Humperson with Deloitte. I'm an investment advisor to the pension fund, and joined by my colleague Andrew Billman. Thanks, Chair. I'll also just largely open to questions on the quarterly performance. Given the time we are now, July, and this report says at March, I'll pass over to Andrew in a second just to provide you with an updated picture on the performance to bring you up to speed with where the fund is at the end of June. Before I do that, just two updates really on the investment managers to bring to your attention. First is Partners Group Multi-Asset Credit Fund. We spoke to you about this at the last meeting. This fund was due to finalise this summer, at which point all the investment would be paid back. Sorry for clarity and any new members. This is a fund of private loans that the fund invested in about 7 years ago, which had a 7-year time horizon. There's about 20% of the investment left in this fund, and the pandemic last year impacted a number of these loans, particularly loans in the leisure and hotel sector. So the manager Partners Group asked for an extension to the fund, an extension of 3 years. The alternative was that the fund would be forced to sell these loan positions at significantly lower value than they'd invested in. So that was agreed by this committee and also by all other investors in the fund. So that fund has now been extended for 3 years and will come to an end in the summer of 2024 now instead of this summer. Second update is Aviva's infrastructure fund. The manager communicated to all investors a couple of months ago and asked if any investors would be interested or willing in to increase their investment or to reinvest the income, to reinvest the distributions that it receives from the investment over a time horizon. The reason being this would provide the fund with more assets to service new projects that they are committed to, and would avoid Aviva having to go out to externally gather new assets. So to bring you up to speed, our response to that was that we needed more information. So for example, how long would Aviva need income to be reinvested, and what was their contingency if they didn't get that from other funds? What was the sort of prioritisation of steps that they would look to, whether that be introduce leverage into the fund, find new investors, So we gave an answer of not sure, but we need more information, which we should get back from Aviva in the next couple of weeks. I wanted to bring you up to speed with those two developments. Unless there's any questions, Chair, sorry, I'll hand over to Andrew, but I'll just pause there for questions.
I'm not seeing any questions here, so I think we're okay to move on.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Chair. I'm Andrew Bowman. I'm an investment consultant at Deloitte. And as Kevin said, I'll briefly cover the performance over the last 3 months to 30th of June 2021. We received this data today, so I should kind of note that this may be subject to change as we kind of discussed with Northern Trust, the fund's custodian. So it was a second successive quarter over the year of 2021 with a positive performance of the fund of 4.2%, which was broadly in line with the weighted benchmark. Performance was driven mainly through the fund's equity allocation, with outperformance at asset level from Oak Hill Advisors, the diversified credit strategy, and the fund's bond allocation through the LSIV Global Bond Fund managed by PIMCO. And this offsets some underperformance from the Absolute Return Fund at the SIV managed by Ruffer. As Matt mentioned as well, the fund has had a very good year over the 1 year period to the 30th of June, delivering 14.3%, which we equate to about a 1.5% outperformance against the weighted benchmark. And that was mainly driven by the Ruffer managed fund, the Absolute Return Fund. Now, given that I don't believe any of you will have this data, I'll open it up to questions by either myself or Kevin, which might be easier.
I don't know if we have any questions. I'm not seeing any hands up here. I've got a hand up from Mike Adam. Mike.
Thanks. Actually, just a question relating to what Matt was saying earlier about the liabilities, and take the point that the discount rate and the government gilt rates are moving. But obviously the actuary's making his analysis based on a whole load of factors, including longevity, including inflation, including earnings expectations. So when we update our funding level quarter on quarter, is it actually an accurate estimate? Because unless you update all of the assumptions, then you're not comparing like with like.
So I think the funding updates are just that. They're not as accurate as a triennial valuation. They don't go into individual member data. They don't update for a number of things on a quarterly basis. So it's definitely not as accurate as when we'll get to the position in a few months' time, or not a few months. Well, yeah, it's coming around very quickly. So in 6 months' time, when we do it again, we'll have a much better idea of what the real funding level is. I suspect that there's going to be some significant changes, some of the other factors. So I think mortality might see further decreases as we've seen unprecedented excess deaths in the last couple of years. And I think the experience, which is where the actual experience of the fund and the facts differ from what you expected, you get what's called experience gains and losses. And so I expect that the fund will get a few of those in terms of sort of mortality areas, and as well in terms of inflation. Pension fund increases over the period have been quite low because inflation has been quite stable. So I think that's going to be another area where there'll be an experience gain. So I actually think we'll be in a better position if things stay the same for the next 6 months than it appears. So that's what my guess would be. I'm not an actuary, but based on what I know about the process and how the assumptions work, I would assume we'll be in a marginally better position than the quarterly updates are telling us.
Thanks very much. I'm not seeing any other hands in the room. I don't know if we have any questions online. I'm not seeing anything. Assuming there's no further comments from the officers, or I don't know if Kevin, if you have anything else to add, or if you're happy for us to acknowledge, in which case I think we're happy to note the contents of the report. Moving on then to item number 16, we have the investment strategy update. And just for clarity, although one of the recommendations looks like a decision, it's not a formal decision. So those online are able to participate, which I'm sure they'll be thrilled to hear. Again, this item has a potential to have some exempt issues coming up. So again, if officers want to flag that up, then we can carry on the discussion in the exempt part of the agenda. But other than that, if I pass over to Phil and the officers to introduce the item.
Thank you, Chair. So again, arising from the previous Pension Fund Committee, members will recall the approval of 3 new investment types, one of which was subject to further negotiation with the manager and then some consultation with officers and the chair as to whether or not to proceed, or if we chose to proceed, then it would require the chair's approval. So 2 of those, in terms of the due diligence and the paperwork documentation, all of that's been successfully implemented. So that's 5% of the fund into the Alpha Real Capital Ground Rents Fund, 2.5% into the Man Group Social Housing Fund. That leaves 2.5%, which the committee approved subject to further due diligence work. And this was in Henley's Secure Income Fund. That was subject to fund achieving satisfactory statistics on certain factors and improved metrics. The main one of those was the rate of occupancy within the Henley portfolio, which was regarded by officers and the consultant as being too low to achieve the desired level of income. So officers engaged in a call with Henley, and it was Mike Adam who accompanied officers on that call. The consensus of opinion between officers and a consultant and Mike was that we really didn't have sufficient faith in the occupancy rates for this particular investment to work. So that was put to the side for the time being, obviously to bring the matter to the committee's attention on this particular evening. I will hand over to Kevin to expand further on that. As I say, the occupancy rates was one concern. Another concern that we were quite worried about was the acquisition by Henley of a building for which they couldn't use. So it was in the portfolio, but they were unable to use that building. So again, that was another red flag. Kevin, would you like to take it from there?
Yeah, so sure. So I mean, sorry, if you don't mind, just especially for the new members, just a little bit of background to the whole sort of strategy change. It actually started about this time last year, where the fund disinvested from a long lease property, or what was largely a long lease property mandate with M&G, and that was the intention was to reallocate into other inflation-linked secure cash flow investments that didn't have the same concentrated risk that the M&G portfolio had, particularly with rent collections impacted by the pandemic last year. So the 3 target investments were ground rents, which we selected Alpha Real Capital for 5%, affordable housing, which we selected Man Group for 2.5%, and the remaining 2.5% was for social supported housing, which we had earmarked, if you like, for Henley. As Phil said, there was a couple February, I think February this year, and the key one being occupancy rates. And so the decision was taken to make the commitment in principle, but on the basis that when we got comfortable that the occupancy rates had increased, we could make that investment. So the original plan was sort of to assess over the course of this year. Henley informed us that they'd be closing the fund in June, And so the decision really to invest in the fund or not would have to be taken in June. We had an update call with them at the end of April, at which point the occupancy rates, I think, were at 77%. You could see them increasing. The target was still for them to continue to increase towards the end of the year. And well, I think we're pretty comfortable that we could, we understood the rationale for how occupancy rates were going to increase. We just weren't comfortable at the point at which, in May with the fund closing, we weren't comfortable enough to make that decision. So the investment wasn't made, which leaves us with 2.5%. In effect to be allocated. Now it's not sitting in cash, it's sitting with buffer at the moment, because that's where we decided to put the M&G disinvestment while we source these three new investments. But nonetheless, it's 2.5% that will have to be given a long-term allocation for the fund. Just to give an update on developments we've had with Henley and to make the committee aware, they have since come back with an update. Firstly, the fund itself has been extended until September, and they proposed an alternative option, which would be to invest in a new fund. The new fund would invest in new assets that they find, as will the existing fund. But being new, it won't have the exposure to some of the legacy assets, legacy issues that we highlighted with the current fund. There's also a few other changes, such as it won't be pure social supported housing. That will be a large part of the fund, but it will also invest in affordable housing, which may have an impact on the yield. It will certainly have an impact on our fund, as we already have an affordable housing allocation. But nonetheless, I wanted to update the committee of that development, and it might be something that we look at in the future or not.
So, Chairman, the officer's recommendation as the alternative offering instead of Henley would be the Darwin Leisure Development Fund, where a paper was presented at the previous meeting. And the benefits of that particular opportunity, inflation protected rentals on the returns, given the long-term income of the development, quite an inefficient, fragmented market, leaving room for consolidation in the future if Darwin was bought up by one of the major operators. High barriers to entry, which is obviously in terms of competing demands for that particular land use, and the advent of staycations, where holidays within the UK seem to be at a bit of a premium following the pandemic. So Darwin does have a track record within the LGPS. Considerable number of managing authorities have invested over a period of more than 10 years, and it's one of the more successful LGPS stories, certainly over that period of time. So the officer recommendation, Chair, is that Darwin be invited in to present to the committee at the next opportunity.
I think so. We've prepared a paper on that fund as part of the exempt, although I'd be happy to cover it at that stage of the meeting or take any questions if that's easier.
Happy to wait till we go into exempt territory, Chair.
I'm not noticing any hands in the room here. I don't know if there's anyone online who wants to ask questions, or if there is anybody who has questions on the exempt part, maybe stick a hand up now so we know we need to discuss it, or if not, are we able to actually just go ahead with the recommendation? I'm actually saying I think we may just be able to deal with the recommendation now. I'm assuming that's for committee members joining us online. Is that all okay? Anybody wants to switch on a camera and give us a thumbs up or something? I'm assuming there's no dissension, so I think we're okay with that. We've got at least one thumbs up. So the recommendation is to note the strategy update and invite Darwin to the next committee meeting to present their leisure development fund offering. So I think we're all happy with that. I've got one question from Councillor Rowbottom.
Apologies, I've done that out of sync. My curiosity got the better of me. So I, again, new to this committee, but I wondered how we selected who to invest in.
So in terms of the specific strategies for which to achieve a diversified portfolio, and Hammersmith and Fulham is probably the most diversified portfolio in the London boroughs. So it does provide a lot of protection in the event that equities suffer a volatile situation, as we've seen over the last year. We're also looking to invest to protect the fund from future inflation pressures. And we've seen those inflation figures shoot up in recent months. So the investment in real assets, such as housing opportunities and specific development funds where bricks and mortar is part of the fabric of the fund. So it follows a general pattern of diversification and future inflation protection, and achieving that diversified fund which protects against volatility.
That all makes sense. I guess it's is there which list do you monitor? Up and coming industries, or is there a sort of point of reference? Are there restrictions on what can be invested in or can't? I know that's probably, we could double the meeting time for that. So even just to give an overview of how you look at these, how you've selected, or what the process is for selecting these particular companies.
So if we have a particular part of the investment strategy that we are keen to focus in with a particular theme, say for example, investment in social housing, or investment in real assets, or protection on CPI inflation, we would ask the Deloitte consultant to provide a short list, and a long list and then a short list of suitable managers who from their research would be able to satisfy that part of the investment strategy. I don't know if you want to come in there, Kevin.
Yeah, Phil, I would add that we have a manager research team that researches the universe of investment managers. As Phil says, we provide a long list of providers in this market, in a particular market we're looking at. So if, for example, we take the recent example of disinvesting from the long lease property and looking for a ground rents manager, we provide a long list of providers in this market with our view on each provider that helps us arrive at the shortlist. The shortlist is then invited to present to the committee, at which point we make a decision on which provider to select. And the only sort of caveat to that at times is, because the London Civ acts as a pooling vehicle available for all the London boroughs, they too have a list of investment managers and investment providers on their platform. And when we are looking for a particular asset class, we will also look at what is available on the London Civ with a preference to use that if it fits with our overall strategy.
Great, thank you. That makes sense.
Thank you very much. Assuming then we're all happy to accept the recommendation, then thank you very much. And we'll move on to the next item, 17, the Section 113 agreement review. Again, potential for exempt discussion here. So if we stray into that territory, then we can move that to the end of the meeting. Phil, if you're able to introduce.
So thank you, Chair. The Tri-Borough team has been in existence since 2012, February 2012. And I have several predecessors in this particular position that I've occupied since December 2017. So this is the first time that the Tri-Borough agreement has been reviewed. We did employ a consultant to do this, and he is reported on the basis of as you see within the paper. The focus of his review, and we've paid heed to all of the recommendations that he's come up with, so basically is to keep the arrangement as it is, but to have more of a focus on the progress that we make, the key performance indicators of the standards that we've achieved, in terms of being able to add value to the governance of the pension fund, laying out our staff structures and communications, having a regular form of monitoring of the contract and reporting to the committee on that basis, setting out in detail the cost recharge arrangements. So all of those aspects have been brought into the revised agreement, which those areas didn't exist before. So happy to take any specific questions on this, but this is basically the revised tri-borough agreement and the new basis on which we will work for the tri-borough authorities.
And just looking, I'm not seeing any hands up, any virtual hands. I'm not seeing any virtual hands. So again, this is just a report for noting, assuming we're all happy with this. I think we are all happy with this. So that was a very easy one and no need to go into an exempt agenda. Excellent. So moving on to the final item. Again, this is a for decision item, and this is a formal decision. Just to run through quickly at the head of this item, the recommendations are listed on page 297, and they can that decision can only be taken by the members in this room. I don't know, I think we'll just get Phil to introduce again a potential for this to go into an exempt agenda, but obviously we are now towards the end of the meeting, so that's maybe not so much of an issue. Phil, if you want to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the procurement process that we carried out for the actuarial services. We've had a very good relationship with Barnett Waddingham since the start of the contract, and Barnett Waddingham do the actuarial services for all three of the tri-borough pension funds, as well as many of the other London borough pension funds. In competition was, I'm just wondering if we can go into exempt status. Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. I know we've got Amrita on the call who might be able to advise on this. If we're moving into exempt now, obviously we'll need to stop the broadcast to the public. Amrita, are you on the call at the moment? Are you able to advise if we can move into exempt agenda and stop broadcasting?
Chair, this is the last item on the open agenda. David Abbott can stop the live broadcasting and we can go on to the exempt part of the meeting.
Of course, this is the one part of the meeting where David Abbott has just left the room very swiftly. So this is just before we do move into the exempt section, I did have one question. Do we have to do exempt minutes, or was that covered under the main minutes section at the start of the meeting?
Chair, in the chair's notes, you'll have to do the exempt minutes and the exempt if there's anything that you want to raise. Otherwise, they'll be approved.
Fine. I don't know if we're able to stop the broadcast.
Not until David Abbott is back. Sorry.
Okay. In which case, maybe we should. Yeah. Does anyone have any jokes? The one time we need him, and of course he leaves the room.
Chair, I could bring up any other business I was planning to update the committee with.
Yeah, no, that would be perfect. Oh no, in fact, we have. Well, if you want to deal with any other business, that's fine. We were waiting for your return, David, as we need to stop the broadcast as we're moving into the exempt section of the meeting.